Finance and Administration and CFO, Stacy Pearson, has done, and her team. This has been work that we generally see over at least one Regent meeting, but Stacy and her team have introduced this in January to the Regents, and then we reviewed it again in March, and now we're here getting ready for action tomorrow at our board meeting. And if you, like me, might be a little bit more old school and needed to print your packet, just this particular section on this committee was over 200 pages worth of information that she and her team have compiled with reports and really good insight from other groups throughout the system that have provided us input. So hopefully you've had a chance to take a look. We have some tremendous leaders that will go through with some high-level summaries of what is contained within the information in your board packet. But I just want to offer my appreciation for all that she and her team have done, and want to just pass it over to you. There are multiple agenda items that have your name on them during this meeting. The first is that we'll kick off with the fiscal year 2022 athletics budget update. I don't know if our athletic director, Pat Chung, is also joining us, perhaps virtually, but
I believe he's still in flight somewhere trying to get here, so he'll be in a little bit later. But this is just an update, so I think I can manage it. And I do believe that John Tarlow is on the phone if we have additional questions. So just a reminder, there he is. Hello, John.
Hi, everybody.
John would have been here in person, but his wife is going to give birth any day now, and so I thought it best that maybe he appear on the video instead. I wouldn't want to be responsible for him not being there. So just a reminder that this is the current year fiscal 22 athletics budget, and we just give you an update at each of the Regents meetings. And there is really no significant change. However, as we looked at the amounts, how we finished last fiscal year and then the current fiscal year, we did decide to transfer $1 million. So remember when we did our bond refunding, we saved $11 million. We kind of set that aside to help us with the athletics budget. So we did make a decision to move $1 million of that savings away from 22 to 23 because we feel like we're in good shape for this year. So we're kind of thinking about next year. So that's really the only difference from what you would have seen at the March meeting. So that's depicted on page 2 of that item, page F1. And if you look down on that chart, there's a footnote A, showing that $1 million of savings from fiscal year 22 to 23, because we're comfortable that we will end the fiscal year in accordance with the budget, doing a little bit better, so then we can move that to the next fiscal year. And so your action items at the very end of this agenda is to approve the FY23 budget, and so you'll see that in there. So this is really just an update at this point.
Stacy, did I read that correctly that you would intend to use that for Pac-12 dues then?
In FY23.
Okay. Thanks.
any questions for John or Stacy?
It's nice to have such a boring athletic budget.
I never take that for granted.
It's important that we just continue with our
Stacy's
quarterly
like, you call it boring.
Yeah, you know all the stress.
Yeah,
that goes
exactly.
into- We like to make it boring, don't we, John?
No, that's the end game.
Okay, hearing that there's no other questions.
Okay, then next, do I need to go? Skip one. Skip one?
Yep.
Okay.
Are we gonna head to?
We're gonna
fiscal year?
head to, apparently our consultants aren't yet online.
Okay.
So we're going to go to the,
Fiscal year 2021 annual financial report,
Right.
trends and debt report.
yes,
Okay. Ooh, excellent. So
Matt
Morning.
Skinner and Molly Holt. Molly is our executive director and controller, and you all know Matt, our senior associate vice president. And things are a little bit different this year, and here's what I'm going to blame. So we closed our first year on Workday, where we had half the year on Legacy and half the year on Workday, and we hired a new external auditor. So we went from having the state auditor do our audited financial statements to Bailey. So we're going to give you the financial trends and updates for fiscal year 21 at this meeting. And then at the September meeting, the auditors will come and give the audit opinion and all of that. And then we'll just go from there. So one thing I will say before we get started with Matt is when you listen to this information and look at some of our trends, I mean, it's been a pretty extraordinary 5 years, really, because we had the 3 years of fiscal recovery and then 2 years of COVID. So as you review our financials, I think you'll be pretty pleased with, the progress that we've made, but it's also been in some pretty trying situations. Definitely not perfect yet, but I'm pretty proud of the progress that's been made. So with that, I'll let Matt go
Stacy,
ahead.
could we just pause for a quick second? It looks like we have our consultant. So I
okay.
hate to just continue to keep pivoting and adjusting, but I think before we dig into this
Yeah, it would
presentation, is
probably
that-
be better
that
to
all
go
right?
back to that and put up the.
Since
That
we
and
weren't
Molly?
sure since we
Please
started
come
early
back.
that they would be able to get here, but they're here.
Okay,
They're
great.
here, and then I'll
Thank you,
bring,
Molly
Sorry.
and Matt.
I'll bring in a new crew then, if Ellen and Linda will.
Just
join me.
switch chairs.
Musical chairs with Stacy. So,
Let's just see how we can move things around on Stacy a little bit more.
after the last 2 years, we got
Do
this.
anything.
We can move around.
Yeah, I'll go ahead and get started. So in January of this year, we reported to you that our housing and dining bonds are subject to a rate covenant, a bond covenant that requires the system to produce net revenue in each of the fiscal years at 125% of their annual debt service payments. Well, during the year that we were remote, they weren't able to meet that. And so the covenant requires that we bring in a consultant to evaluate and look at the rates, look at the operations, and make some recommendations, and then report those to the Regents. And that's what we'll do right now.
So to address the housing and dining system bond covenants, Reith Jones Advisors, RJA, were engaged by Student Affairs to conduct an operational review of the university's campus housing and dining system. This presentation you're about to see by Richard Reith, principal, and Kurt Meadows, senior advisor, includes a summary of findings and recommendations for the housing and dining system to meet our bond debt service requirements in fiscal year 2022. We selected RJA based on their extensive experience providing advisory services to institutions of higher education. Their experience includes customized advisory services for real estate planning, development, and operations. They have completed market and demand studies, feasibility analyses, strategic plans, operating reviews, capital budgeting, master plans, public-private partnerships, and disposition and monetization efforts for institutions and assets of all shapes and sizes. They recently completed a thorough analysis of Washington State University's housing and dining operations, including stress tests of existing budget assumptions and a review of all housing and dining rate schedules. Their in-depth analysis was used to support their recommendations and findings required by the bond covenants. I have Linda McDermott here next to me. She's the Assistant Vice President for Finance and Administration in Student Affairs, who works very closely with RJA throughout this entire process. She's partly going to be the clicker advancer, so an important role. So Richard, I think the floor is yours.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. And it's a pleasure to meet you all virtually. Very excited to be here and to have this conversation. And my name is Richard Reith with Regents Advisors. I'm a principal, and unfortunately my colleague Kurt Meadows, who was intimately involved in this analysis, had a personal emergency pop up this afternoon and won't be able to join. And before we really dive in, would like to say a heartfelt thank you to the Washington State team for all of the time and effort and work that went into providing the information and the context that really supported our analysis. And as we think about some of the objectives, which I think we largely just touched on, our approach really comprised 4 different kind of primary categories. An existing conditions analysis, which looked at housing and participation trends, the residential program, dining offerings, as well as the off-campus market and what is available to students from a rental rate perspective, occupancy levels, and in general, how the market is performing. Additionally, we did regional benchmarking, and we looked at some of the university's regional competitors to look at their enrollment trends, what they're offering from a housing and dining perspective, and especially price points. And then lastly, the other component was sensitivity testing and scenario testing, where we took the existing FY22 budget that was prepared by the university team and ran it through a series of analytical tests to determine whether or not we would be able to realize that minimum 1.25 times debt service coverage ratio, or 125% of the annual debt service. So as we think about our key takeaways from the analysis that we conducted, the housing and dining system, as we move on to slide 3, projects about $23.1 million in net revenue available for debt service, which results in a projected coverage ratio of about 2.47 times for fiscal 22, or nearly double the minimum requirements. We feel confident in the university's ability to realize both the revenue and expense projections for some reasons that we'll touch on here and a little bit in the presentation. And as part of the stress testing or the scenario testing, we thought about it in 3 different ways. And in using the 125% of debt service as kind of our bottom line, we realized that revenues could decrease from 16.7% from the projections. Our expenses could increase 25.2% over the projections, or some combination of an $11.4 million increase or decrease in revenue and increase in expenses would still result in the university realizing and achieving that minimum covenant threshold. Outside of the actual dollars and cents, we did identify a handful of opportunities that we think merit further exploration as it relates to adjustments to the suite style housing rates and thinking about the pricing of the board plan, as well as kind of the overall rate structure and board plan structure for the university. There are a lot of different rates across all the different buildings and unit configurations at Washington State. And so we think that there's an opportunity to consolidate the number of rates to make it easier for students as they're evaluating and going through their decision-making process, potentially generate additional incremental revenue, and then ultimately reduce the administrative burdens on the university team as it relates to identifying, tracking, and then implementing those rate structures. From an expense standpoint, we're all aware of the inflationary pressures and the recent large increase in year-over-year inflation. And so that inflationary pressure on goods, services, and labor, as well as the required capital investments that are needed across the housing and dining system, certainly pose risk to the system. However, student enrollment is going to continue to be the biggest driver of the housing and dining system's revenue line item into the future. As we think about the revenues themselves, and this slide here focuses on housing revenues, obviously we had a big dip in fall 2020. And the chart on the bottom left shows FTIC or first time in college, as well as total student capture rates. And those are the number of residents in either first time in college students or your total student population that live on campus. And so as you can see here, with the exception of fall 2020, we've had a pretty consistent and actually improving capture rate, which really speaks to the quality of the residential experience in the program at the university. However, the chart on the right, as we look at the projected housing revenues, even with those stronger capture rates in fall 21 as it compares to fall 19 or fiscal year 19 or fiscal year 18, we still are not projecting to generate as much revenue. And that is largely driven by the approximately 8.7% decrease in the number of undergraduate students from fall 2018 to fall 21. As we transition from the housing system to the dining system, kind of a similar story in thinking about solid revenue performance for the fall 18 semester, really through the fall 19 semester, the drop in spring 20, bottoming out in fall 21, and then gradually kind of making our way back up. One of the things that we thought was really interesting is that thinking about the amount of revenue that we can generate is largely driven by the number of students that we have on campus. And so one of the encouraging trends that we've seen and identified from the dining perspective is that for fiscal year 22, we are projecting to generate more revenue per enrolled student this year than we were in our previous high of about $1,318 for fiscal year 19. Conversely, from the revenue standpoint, we'll touch on expenses. And from the housing standpoint, the FY22 projected operating expenses are actually a little bit below the FY20 housing operating expenses. And that's largely been driven by about a 43.5% reduction in the cost of goods and services as part of the housing operating budget. So it's great that we are below our FY20 numbers, but ultimately we can only keep and reduce our cost of goods and services for so long before we need to make investments in the capital facilities, in additional repairs and maintenance. And so our anticipation is that as that 43.5% reduction continues to increase and get back to a more normalized level, that will ultimately likely outpace the revenue generation of the housing facility, or the annual revenue generating increase across housing. From a dining standpoint, we are also below, our FY22 expenses are below both the FY19 and the FY20. A lot of that is driven by the fact that we do have less revenue, and a big driver of the dining expenses are the actual cost of the food. And so if we're selling less food, then our operating expenses are going to be reduced. The other kind of interesting component is, and as we think about the dining expenses, is that for every dollar of revenue that the dining system collects, we spend on average about $1.02 in expenses. So we are the dining system is on a standalone financial basis. It is not self-sufficient, but that is also why we think about it as a housing and dining system rather than a housing system independent from a dining system. But we think that that's something that as we continue and move into the future, that we want to evaluate and really hone in on to make sure that we're optimizing the dining operations. So in summary, this is a table here that shows some of the three different kind of scenarios that we talked about: the expense increase, the revenue reduction, or the combination. And so as we looked at the projected revenues, they were largely the housing revenues, which make up 2/3 of the total housing and dining system revenues. They're projected on about 4,200 occupants, and we actually had 4,300 occupants in January of 2022. So that gives us a strong level of confidence that we're going to realize the majority of our revenue projections. And from an expense standpoint, we did a trends analysis looking at different points during the fiscal year, how much have we spent in operating expenses as of November 30th, which is the date by which we started this analysis, and then looked at trends and extrapolated them over the previous fiscal years, but using fiscal year 22 dollars to try and understand where we might end up in terms of total FY22 expenses. And we think that the expense projections are conservative, and then ultimately we'll be able to realize and end up with at or below the level of expense projections, which results in approximately the 2.47 times debt service coverage ratio. And in summary, like we talked about, the lower enrollment, the 8.7% of undergraduate students, the decrease from FY18 to FY20, or from fall 18 to fall 21, excuse me, that's really the primary driver of the housing and dining system's performance from a revenue standpoint outside of COVID. We think that in the projections show and in our analysis shows a rebound in the housing and dining system revenues to a little bit over $68 million this year, which is still shy of some of the previous historical highs. But it's been a great rebound coming out of the pandemic. Outside of the revenues, the housing system really, you're in a great competitive position in terms of how many students, how many first-year students you capture compared to your regional competitors, and that you have higher first-year capture rates in housing than most of the institutions that were in our regional competitor set, and your on-campus rates for housing options outside of the first-year housing are really economically priced relative to the surrounding off-campus competition. I think that as we went in and did our analysis, there may be some opportunity to generate additional incremental revenue through those facilities, but they also require some pretty significant capital investments in order for students to realize the value proposition. And then ultimately, I think the big takeaway is that based on all of our analysis and the assumptions that have been provided, the combined housing and dining system will exceed the minimum required coverage ratio of 1.25 times, again, with a projection of about 2.47 times.
Excellent. Thank you so much. Any other commentary that you want to add
I
to?
don't think so. I think if you all have questions, though, certainly while we have Richard online and Linda and Stacy and others here.
Yeah, it's great news. Yes.
Yeah.
Anyone have any other questions regarding the materials or the presentation?
How does the here, where do the capital improvement funds come from? Obviously not from housing and dining, around maintenance and upgrading and for the physical space of the housing.
They actually do come from the
They
housing
do.
and dining
Okay,
system.
so when I see that breakdown of where, the money is going, or, when it's salary and benefits, the cost of food services, goods and services, where's the percentage, or do we have a percentage that goes into the?
There is a line item for just annual maintenance and capital improvements, but the majority of the expense comes in the debt service because most of the major improvements have come through borrowing. And one of the reasons why it's so important to meet these covenants is that to ensure that we're able to reinvest, and if we have to borrow additional funds to improve our facilities, it's likely going to come from borrowing. That said, we have a pretty substantial, a lot of credit goes to the operation in general. For years, we have a significant fund balance. We had to draw down into that in 21 because of COVID, but yeah, we have a significant cash balance in our system that helps us reinvest in our capital improvement.
Change out the chairs or.
Yes, and we have a
match
lot
those.
of needs.
Okay, thank you.
Right?
Yeah, my question is about the proposed increases. And so is this analysis under the assumption that those proposed increases are approved, or is this assuming current rates were continued, or some combination of both?
This analysis was on fiscal year 22, the one we're just about ready to wrap up. So they were providing confidence and an opinion that we could meet the debt covenant for FY22 and that our rate structure moving forward, we could continue that. So the rates that are proposed will help us address the inflationary pressures on the expenditure side moving forward. So they're kind of two separate issues. But for example, if they would have come back and said, no, your existing rate structure moving forward, you're not going to be able to meet those debt requirements, they would have questioned more about what we were proposing for the future if they didn't think we'd be able to meet them.
So their assumption that we will be able to meet them as provided here is based on the idea that the rates will be increased essentially.
Yes, in order to keep up with the cost of ongoing costs of operations.
And just to follow on to that, what I understood when I was looking at the key takeaways under the executive summary was almost that bookend scenarios were run so that, because a lot of this is obviously dependent on enrollment and which plays a factor in fees and it's a whole system, right? So I appreciated the projected revenues, the increase, decrease, and the, what that kind of threshold looked like. So am I interpreting that correctly, that there's a range here? So to answer Regent Wright's question too, it depends on increases, but there's a range in what that looks like and we'd still meet the covenants.
Correct.
I think that the other kind of key component is, you're correct, that they are bookends with the minimum 1.25 times coverage ratio. But for the purposes of the bond documents, these are effectively adjusted operating expenses. So they don't account for, Linda, like you had mentioned, the need to compile and add to the fund balance to make minor capital improvements or major or help offset some of the costs of the major capital improvements. And so really the continued kind of operational efficiency and operational improvements to generate more revenue and more capital for reinvestment in the facilities is a key component of the housing and dining system moving forward.
Any other questions? Thank you for your time. We appreciate the presentation and you're sharing good news. So appreciate that too.
Thank you all very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Richard.
All right, so Matt and Molly, back up.
See
Sorry
you
for
later.
the
Stay
back
safe.
and forth. All right, so we're back to the annual financial report trends and debt report. And Stacy was right in the moment to pass on to Matt and introduce Matt.
Yes, well, good afternoon and sorry for that. I know we all got very excited thinking that this financial statement report was coming and then it's challenging. So thank you for your patience. So it was good to be here with everybody. Thanks for your time. Let's see.
Yeah, do you want me to do that or, okay?
So bring a few items we'll cover during our time together today. A reminder of how WSU tracks our fiscal health from year to year. A summary of how our financial statements for fiscal year 21 turned out. Then we'll do our normal benchmarking, where we look at our trends over time compared to peers and others. Then we'll wrap up with our debt report, which is required under Board of Regents Policy 5 regarding debt. So a couple reminders as we think about our fiscal health. On one side, we track this really often, our core budget. We're looking at our major sources of revenue, state, tuition dollars, F&A, our auxiliaries, and monitoring that month to month. This to see how we're trending, how things are doing, how things look from a fiscal health perspective. Then we have an opportunity annually to pull everything together into the financial report, which includes all of our fund types, including capital funds and donated funds. And it's also on what we would call the accrual basis of accounting. So you'll see things in there that you wouldn't normally see in daily budget management. You'll see depreciation, you'll see longer term liabilities, things in there. So it's a nice, useful picture of the whole university. The other reason why the financial statements are helpful is there's strong guidance on how those statements come together. And because all universities follow those same set of accounting rules, we can use them for benchmarking. We get pretty consistent information as we do that. And we'll do some of that benchmarking together today. Stacy mentioned this as we got started. This has been a unique year for us as we, Molly's team, and I should give Molly and her team a huge shout out. They've been working really hard to pull the financial statements together for fiscal year 21 out of 2 different systems to pull that information together and a brand new auditor. And our auditors are doing exactly what we hoped. It's the first time we've ever had a non-state auditor involved in the university's financial statements. And we were hoping that they would find new things and have new suggestions for us, and they do. They have lots of things that they are asking about why we do things the way we are. And so we're looking forward to that. We embrace those changes and How this will play out then over the next few weeks is we think the auditors will finish their work on the financial statements by the end of this month. They always hold an exit with the chair of the Finance and Compliance Committee, so Regent Shower will have opportunity to join them for an audit exit. And then we'll come back to the board in September to let you know how that audit turned out, with any findings and recommendations they have for improvement. We think we'll get a number of opportunities they'll identify that will help us become better financial managers versus resources. So we're grateful for their work. Okay, with that, I'll turn it over to Molly to just take us through a summary of the financial statement results. I guess I should remind everybody, these are unaudited statements, so they could change a little bit still between now and when the financial statements post. In fact, Tuesday morning, we had a little breakthrough with the auditors on some revenue that we've really trying to get figured out, and had a little breakthrough there, which is awesome. We're super excited, and that's going to change a couple of these numbers.
Hello. What you see in front of you is a statement of net position. So we are under GASB for financial reporting, and we issue 3 statements, the first of which is a statement of net position, which pretty much equates to a balance sheet for not-for-profit and profit companies. Matt let me deliver this slide, and of the 8 components of our statement of net position, all 8 have a positive trend. So that was very exciting news for us. So our assets and deferred outflows increased by 158 million. Again, great news for us. That was driven by an increase in cash and investments, driven by a very strong return on investment here. We also had an $80 million increase in the land grant endowment and the WSU true endowment that is managed by the foundation. So again, that raised 158 million. Our liabilities and deferred outflows decreased, again, another good indicator. Part of that decrease was related to pension and other post-deployment benefits. Those were impacted by changes to actuarial assumptions, as well as impacted very strongly by investment returns. The decrease was partially offset by savings from debt refinancing and issuance of some new debt. So going to our equity section, which is we have sections as, again, a GASB reporter. In our net position, we have net investment in capital assets, which is our capital assets less depreciation associated debt. Restricted non-expendable, which is pretty much the corpus of our endowment. We have restricted expendable, which is our earnings, funds that we can actually expend. We report our loans separately. Those are our student loans, and our unrestricted, which is our most discretionary, and that's an indicator of the unrestricted assets that the university has available. So again, very positive news on that as well. Our next statement is our statement of revenues, expenses, and changes in that position. So that is effectively our income statement. Again, really good news here. For our operating revenues, they did decline slightly, but that is a pretty amazing number considering it was a COVID year. Our operating expenses decreased slightly as well by 25 million. We should cover the operating revenue piece. Our operating revenue, our total tuition and fees increased from 465 million to 473. That's a 2% increase, and that was driven by enrollment headcount declining and offset slightly by some tuition increases. The estimated scholarship allowance increased by 12 million from 72 to 84 million, and waivers decreased from 80 to 75 million. So this brought our net tuition for 21 to 314 million, which is just $1 million above the previous year. Our overall discount rate is a bit higher from 20 to 21. Our grant revenue did increase 16 million, primarily driven by COVID-related research and funding. And of course, our auxiliary revenue was the one that probably took the hardest hit, as we discussed, related to COVID. Our operating expenses declined slightly, mostly driven by the impact of those benefit OPEB issues that I was speaking of. But other than that, our expenses were fairly flat. Our non-operating revenue increased 74 million. We did have some increases in state appropriation, and the significant increase was due to investment.
Awesome, thanks, Maya, that's great. Any questions about those high-level financials? Okay, so then we have, this is kind of fun for me. Several years ago, we came together to pick some peer groups and some metrics we're going to try to track long-term for the university. And the first we look at is kind of internal focus. We always look at the number of employee FTEs that are here. You know, instruction, research, and service is a very people-intense responsibility. It's the faculty and staff of WSU that deliver all of those services. So we keep an eye on these FTE. It's between 60 to 80% of our total university expense is salary and benefit related. So this chart has been interesting to look at as we step back over a period of time. We see that really fast growth from about 2014 to 2017. That's when we had some very large overspending. Then we saw that moderate down a little bit during that 3-year fiscal recovery. And then that last little bit is kind of interesting, that drop from 20 to 21. We kind of suspect that's probably this new marketplace we're in, where it's very hard to retain and attract employees. And in some ways that drop is not intentional perhaps to save budget, but it's more difficult to hire employees right now than we anticipated. I think we're starting to see that even in that chart there. As we move into some benchmarking against peers, we first look at cash and investments. We have 2 different ratios we look at on this. The first ratio here is spendable cash and investments to operating expense. And what that means is this is a measure as if the university brought in no new revenue for the year, how long could the university continue to operate before it would be out of money? And so this is pretty good for us. You know, we're on with about 4.5 to 5 months right now that we could operate. And what we're pleased with is that trend. We see that improvement happening over the last few years, and we're just starting to peek into the range of our public research peers. So that is really a positive improvement we're seeing there. The next ratio, again, spendable cash investments to debt. This is a measure of how we could use all of our reserves to pay off our debt over time. And here we see even quicker progress versus our peers over the last few years. And that's a combination of a few things. Certainly that focus on building up university reserves that translates to cash investment. Also a really thoughtful management of our debt portfolio, being very careful about when we issue new debt, making sure we have revenues to cover that debt. And also we've been able to take advantage of some really attractive market rates over the last few years with low interest rates to refund some of our debt to reduce that total cost of financing. So that's a pretty positive slide as well.
It's an understatement.
Yeah, that's
Back
awesome.
in
That's a steep
2016
line.
and 17, this looked impossible.
Yeah.
Oh,
So that is great. And we'll know here in a couple more months, we'll have the peer data for 21 too. It'll be interesting to see what everybody else is doing, but that's really positive to get right up in the middle of that cluster as a peer group. Another place we spend some time on from a revenue perspective is we look at tuition discount. Just a little bit of perspective on this before we jump in. There's many different ways to look at waivers, discounts, and scholarships. And so, and sometimes we have some internal debate about this percentage versus other percentages. And what I would say is that what's nice about this is there's a consistent methodology used by all public universities in the United States. They all follow the same methodology, the same formula, and they all get audited. And so what I do on this chart is I'm not really focused on the percentage as much as I am the trend and how we compare to other peers, because there is some value in that ability to benchmark there on discounts and waivers.
And what I would say about this slide is you heard this from Saichi this morning, that WSU is high on that discount rate, meaning we are using our gross tuition revenues to fund these waivers. And this is just a perfect example of where scholarships would help. It would be an outside source of funding to provide these waivers to our students, and leaving that operating revenue then for the university.
Our foundation's assistant to provide the scholarship side.
Yeah, and that's what I think would make a difference on this rate. Again, we're slightly above our peers, but it's, as Matt said, it's also watching the trend, and we'd like to see that come down.
Thanks. The last one we look at is called operating margin. What this means is we look at the revenues the university generates from its activities plus the state appropriations for operations. You add those two together as our revenue, and we compare that to our operating costs. And this is kind of a crazy trend, isn't it? But I think the one that really sticks out again is during that time that prompted us to take on the fiscal recovery, we see that that was really upside down, that we were spending considerably more than the revenue we're bringing in. And now we're seeing that made progress up into a more positive place. We would like that number to always be positive if we can. We have a little more revenue than what we spent. That revenue goes into other expenses of the university to keep us running. So that's really strong progress as well to get right up in that cluster of peers.
So I want to pause for a second.
Yeah, just let's go back and just review.
This is an awesome chart, and I think that we really need to acknowledge and appreciate the difference between 2016 and 2021. And then we need to think about what's happened in our world during several of those years and recognize that where the number is today is a huge accomplishment. And then it's even bigger given what we've been through.
Just all of these slides are just, it's kind
I know,
of
but this is like the
shocking.
culmination slide.
Yeah, but each one of them are so great in their own right on so many levels. So, I mean, this is a moment that I do think everybody just needs to truly just relish in.
I think it's more like a miracle. And you've heard me say this before, but Stacy, I think you and your team should be considered for sainthood because of the miracles you pulled off. Thank you.
But Dave, I would also say to you and to the entire faculty and everybody in this room, like there's some of us who were sitting here in 2018 and you could feel the weight of what that was. I mean, we just, Laura, myself, it was heavy. And I just remember sitting in the Tri-Cities wondering how we find our way out of it, driving back to have to talk to a senator about it and thinking, I'm not sure how to, how to spin this, and Stacy was really confident. She's like, it's going to take time. And Kirk was confident because of all of you. So I just,
well, whatever you're paying Stacy is not enough.
On behalf of the state of Washington, and since we are all appointed by the governor, we're here to say thank you for the fiscal responsibility that you've all demonstrated, and everybody in the room, because it's a group effort. And your team right here, Stacey, you guys have led an amazing, effort, and then somehow you've gotten everyone to follow you, and that's a big deal. That is hard to do for not just 1 year, but multiple years, and then we just go into a pandemic. So I just can't say enough.
Thank you. Those are really kind words, but I will tell you, the university, it's been really challenging. We have a lot of needs and we've had to manage the expenses and, so it's truly a group effort. What we did was set the parameters. Is here's your goal. We're going to measure the goal. It's what we've all been talking about, is we just had to put the goal out there and offer up the tools to help get there. And then people had to be willing to do it. So it absolutely couldn't be done without support from leadership and everyone's willingness to make the sacrifices, because you just had to spend less. And we had to put aside some things that we wanted to fund and some goals, and it's kind of setting us up for this new budget model that you've heard about before, so that we can really match incentivize the revenues and then align those expenses to achieve the revenues. So it feels like this is really a transformational time for WSU to kind of build the foundation, like Workday and all of that, and the new data analytics, and so that sometime in a future year, be pretty pleased at a time that we're going to hit some challenges, with enrollments and things. But it definitely, I remember hearing Regents say, well, it's a good thing we went through the fiscal recovery before COVID hit. And
yes,
that's what this is really showing. It's a good thing that we did that.
Well, and you can't, I think we've all said this before, but President Schultz has been the right person at the right time to have a steady hand and an optimistic view and leading people through this. And he was smart enough to hire really good people. So that's his gift. That's your superpower, Kirk, is you hire great people.
I'm just glad we didn't have to change the axes again. To fit our data on there, that's probably never good. Well done. This is stunning. It's fun to be here and watch how everybody pulled together.
It really is. Somebody please call.
So I just have to add, I mean, Kirk, I don't think you had started officially yet. You were here part-time and we greeted him with his introduction to finance at WSU with all these charts that were just all going negative, and how many presidents like to embrace that from day one, but Kirk did, and it's been steady in providing the framework for us to move forward. And then if I could just add, and then our faculty and staff in campuses, colleges, and departments across the university are really the ones that embraced it, continue to serve our students, continue to do the research and service while still helping us be fiscally responsible. So it's amazing. So thanks for letting me share that. This is pretty impressive. Okay, so that was great. So that was kind of exciting, wasn't it? There we go. There we go. So now we'll talk about that.
And remember this moment as we keep going through the rest of the committee. Okay.
So debt profile. As I mentioned to start off, in accordance with Board of Regents Policy 5 on debt management, we're required to report to the board every year on any debt transactions or activities that occurred during the fiscal year. So this is our official report to comply with that policy. During the year, we had a couple of things that you might remember. Back in October 21, we took on probably our more sophisticated financing, if I could be honest, where we saw really good interest rates in the market. We were able to refund or refinance 3 existing debt series. And then because of the pressures of COVID and concern about the unknown, we wanted to try to get those savings brought to us right away. So we issued another bond with that and brought $11 million of savings right into the current fiscal year. That was great for us. $11 million savings of 11% net present value. I'd say the reason why we always point out that net present value is not only because we're financial nerds, but because our policy requires that certain types of financing meet thresholds, and that's 3% or 5% in the debt policy. So we often refer to that net present value, so you'll know that we're exceeding those thresholds when we do those refinancings. Then also in the summer of 21, we issued another series of new general revenue bonds, 37.8 million that the board approved. That was to support intercollegiate athletics and the impacts of COVID on their budget. So that transaction was completed in the summer. And you saw that in the athletics budget, helping them bridge through this COVID time. The last bullet point in here is kind of cheating a little bit because we just snuck one in there that happened actually just a few months ago for the current fiscal year. We were feeling pretty good about this. Sometimes you read the crystal ball and you get it right in the market. This is one of those. We saw an opportunity to refund one more series of debt, and we really squeezed that into between Thanksgiving and Christmas before the markets closed for the calendar year. And we were able to get that transaction done. That saved $3.5 million to the university. That goes right back into the capital budget. So that was a great little savings. It feels good now because with market rates now 3 months later, we would not have done that transaction.
It wouldn't have met the threshold.
So we're really fortunate that that was done. And thanks to outstanding staff who put in a lot of extra time to get that done during that time of year. So. Just quickly looking at our bond profile, I would just draw your attention on this chart to the chart on the right. Our goal is to move all of our bonds over time into the crimson square. That's general revenue bonds. And that means that we're moving away from individual units or auxiliaries issuing their own debt. Going forward, we always issue all of our debt essentially underneath the university's name and credit, and so we're making progress. Eventually that circle will all be one color, and then we'll stop showing this pie chart again. looking at our total outstanding debt, some highlights on this chart. First, if you look at the columns across the bottom, something we like to look out to is in 10 years, we'll pay off about half of our debt will be paid off. And so that's exciting for us, but also is some strategic opportunity in there that we can use that debt capacity over the next 5 to 10 years to move other strategic priorities forward, which is great. The pie chart at the top is of interest. I just look at that to see how balanced we are, knowing that debt is a limited asset. It's a limited asset that we have available to us. We try to be really balanced with that. And so we like looking at that chart to see that it's been used to move multiple parts of the university strategic growth forward, whether that's academic buildings, student buildings, auxiliary activities, research space. So
I always like this particular one because I think sometimes we get stuck on the athletic bonds and, you know, those expenditures but we need to realize that our entire pie the mix is pretty balanced across the board when you look at revenue, like what generates revenue, help pay for those bonds versus what doesn't. And I appreciate seeing it.
this other slide looks at our annual debt service. That's how much we pay out for all that debt on the previous slide every year. You'll notice a couple of things on this, that this is flatter over the time, and that's intentional. We try to set our debt payments so it's easy to budget for. That every year we're paying about the same amount out in debt every year. Fiscal year 22 total debt service is $52.5 million for the university across those points. Then the last piece of the debt report is a reminder on our bond rating. For WSU, we receive our credit rating or bond rating from Moody's and S&P. They're independent groups that do credit ratings for lots of different organizations in the private sector and in the public sector. In December, we had a new rating assigned to us. We stayed at AA3 stable. That's kind of code, and we'll see on the next slide what that means. Also, in December with S&P, we're able to maintain our rating. And we think that's strong. At a time, we were right in the middle of the pandemic when we had those new ratings, that they were able to look at our financials and say, wow, we're holding you as stable, I think is a testament to the financial stewardship that we're demonstrating every day. So that's great. We certainly don't manage every day to a specific credit rating, but it's a nice outside opinion on how the university is doing. They do a holistic review of our management, our strategic plan, our operations, and they compare it to other universities. So it is a measure or a glimpse of how others think we compare to other universities. So on this chart, then you can look in the column charts and see where we sit. That's public universities in the United States, and you can see that we're in the top half with that AA3 rating. I think the debt policy for the Board of Regents actually says that we strive to maintain an AA2, and Stacy and I are of the opinion that if COVID wouldn't have hit, we probably would have moved up into that AA2 rank. But we'll see. It's hard to move the credit rating, but we think we'll get us back.
Would it not be a fair statement that a lot of public institutions, as well as public entities like public facilities, some did lose ground, but nobody was moving up? Feel like over the past 12 months.
Yeah, maybe you've got a pretty large endowment, maybe, but
Yeah.
you know.
That's what we've seen. You've probably seen something similar in that space.
It's a win to hold the line.
So, okay, well, that is our presentation, the debt report and the financial statements. Ready for questions or discussion?
Any questions?
It's I'm going to echo what my colleague said. Very impressive, the work that you have all done, action, and you know, throughout the university enterprise. It has taken a lot of creativity to live through the stresses that the system's been under. So I just think it's wonderful to see us moving forward, and that will continue, of course.
And you've been through here. You've been a regent for a long time to see all those changes.
Yeah. Well, and Actually, one question I do have, and I should probably know the answer to this, but do we have additional controls that are in place so that we don't get into a similar situation that we were in, like the 2015-16?
Yeah, we're managing budgets. And again, that.
But there's nothing you're managing budgets, but there's not like a trigger that requires something. Just as a
I
question.
think really what it takes is, it wasn't that we couldn't have done it before, but maybe, just somebody saying, let's look at all of the budgets and let's set targets, and then let's look at the targets and see who's making it and who isn't. What does it take to get there? Honestly, it was just accountability, because no, we don't have anything that sets off an alarm when somebody wants to make that one expenditure that goes over, but it's the review of spending.
Well, yeah, the alarm is sort of like, pay attention type thing, which I know you guys are doing now. I just thinking to the future, because it's been a struggle to pull out of it all. So.
Well, ultimately, we'd like to do quarterly accrual basis financial reports, and then you have to, it shows where you are on accrual basis. And, and people like me are looking at that and saying, what's going on here, so.
Yeah.
But, and then again, just giving the colleges and the divisions tools to say, oh, I see where I'm at, or, oh, I'd like to hire a new position, but I can go out and look at my data and see where I am on my personnel budget. And I just don't think that existed before in a kind of the refined level that we needed to.
Well, that's a good point, because there were a lot of comments prior to Workday that people didn't know where they stood in their finances.
If I could, Laura, I think there's three things. The first is, I think we're trying to be very open and transparent with everybody about where our budget is. I think transparency is what keeps you out of there, the first thing. The second is that Stacy, myself, and Elizabeth confer about a lot of financial things. It's not me saying we're going to do X and that somebody's just got to go figure it out. I think we try and do that. And the third, I would say, is strategic planning. If you really are doing a good job with your planning, you're saying these are things we need to do, and then gives you time to figure out how to do it. And it's, people can say, well, we've been always open and transparent with our budget. If I hand you 500 pages of budget documents, yeah, we're open, but you say, well, I'm not going to look through there if something's buried. If we're being effective in our communications and say, here's the things that we're worried about, I think then we're providing the board with good fiscal information to help make decisions. So trust me, in my tenure, I want us to continue to exercise a fiscal restraint so that whoever comes in after I'm done doesn't come into that situation again. And, nobody likes digging themselves out of a hole. So,
well, that's for sure.
yeah. And I think the benchmarks also help, because they
Well,
also show
I think
where we
that's
are
true.
compared to other institutions.
Because the board at the time sort of called a halt to some of this stuff because it was, but we didn't understand the depth that you learned when you first got there. We're really digging into things. So just like to make sure it doesn't happen again.
Rapid fire question for each of you. We did this morning, but if you could have, what's the one thing that if you could do one thing in the next 12 months, what would it be? Magic wand.
I'd be focusing on enrollments.
Matt?
Well, this is fun. So Stacy took enrollments, so then we can cover more ground. So if Stacy took enrollments, we're pretty focused on trying to improve our service levels across all our campuses and colleges. WSU has grown to be tremendously complex, broad span, broad scope, and see if we can't raise our service levels to meet those needs, that we can keep the university moving forward strategically. So while Stacy's all the enrollment, we'll work on those services.
I would say mine's much more operational, that we can close the year much more quickly, get the information and opinion out much more quickly. That's what I'd like to accomplish.
Great, thank you. Any other regents have any other questions before we pivot to the next topic? Okay, thank you. Exactly.
We heard it. It was on the web.
We are headed into now what is the anticipated action items. So this is a dense part of our agenda. Everything that you're gonna see from this point forward, we will be taking action on tomorrow. So if we could go ahead and move forward with the operating budget. And so I know Cece's up. And then we also have Chief Legislative Officer Colleen Kirk, who is joining Stacy for this part of the presentation on the operating budget.
Thank you. And so for these next two items, which is going to be the 23 to 25 state operating budget request and state capital budget request, this first paragraph is that the regents approve the process and for the decision packages, including approval of the established priorities and criteria for developing additional decision packages, but then delegate the authority to the president or designee to approve the final requests and any adjustments that may be needed prior to submission to Office of Financial Management. That's all because of the timing of when these are due and the time that it takes to load those into the budget request for the state and then the regents meeting. So this also is dependent on a meeting in August with the executive committee to discuss that budget request prior to the submission. And then you'll get a report in September of this is what we actually submitted. So that will apply to both of these items. And Pauline will talk about our operating budget request. Oh, yeah.
And we're gonna separate these two because they're a little bit
Yes,
different.
they're
So
a little bit
we're
different,
gonna do
but
thought we'll talk
operating
about
first and then capital.
The
Yeah,
timeline first.
yeah, that'd be great.
So what Stacey referred to is the timeline. So because WSU, we are on a semester system, your schedule, the Regents schedule coincides with the academic calendar. And the governor's schedule for OFM and for submitting decision packages to from state agencies to the governor's office for consideration in the governor's budget does not follow a semester system. So the purpose of this is that it will allow us to give a preview to you and to talk with you about the criteria that we're using for the development of decision packages, but it will allow us the time period from this Regents meeting up until September when we submit decision packages, either September or October, depending on the year, to do the stakeholder engagement. So first, we'll just talk about so I thought we could talk about just the timeline quickly, just to give a frame of reference, and we worked with Regent Shower about that. So one of the things that I very often say is by the time we get to January, all the work is done. I mean, we really want to have all the work done, have talked with all of the stakeholders, and then be working with stakeholders by the time we actually get to members. So January to either March or April is legislative session. And by that time, we are moving very, very quickly, and we are hopefully closing a deal and moving things across the finish line. Very little work will happen in terms of developing decision packages. To the extent that something happens, it's because we're not prevailing on it, or because we're learning information from other stakeholders or from the legislature, but it's really not an active time. This is really the most important time in many respects. Sorry, these two are the most important times in many respects. So we've learned a lot in legislative session. We have a good sense of what we learned over the course of the academic year. And so we, various academic leaders, and those of us who are engaging with stakeholders, because we want to create a feedback loop, are gathering information. This time period between April and May, and we've used here August, but and that is because of an internal timeline. It takes a tremendous workload on finance and administration, specifically the budget office, to develop decision packages. So they are either submitted in September for a biennial budget or in October for a supplemental budget. And so we need to know what we are going to do by August, which is not when there's a Regents meeting. That's one of the timelines that we are working with. So if we can do that stakeholder work, I'll use soil health as an example. Many of us were here and talking and working with soil health. That was a governor's request. We didn't get the request or understand that it was coming through until about April or May. We did bring something to the Board of Regents. It was really only one sentence, but the majority of the stakeholder work to really put that together was all done over this period. And then we worked with the budget office to develop the budget proposal. But this will allow us to do things like that with a little bit better opportunity for development of work with stakeholders, but also our internal stakeholders. What happens then, once we've submitted our decision packages,
that's when we start working with stakeholders again to say, this is what we have submitted to the governor's office and we want your support. And we ask them to support that to the governor's office. This is probably the silent period of lobbying that we forget because it's not in the legislative session. But for those of us who work together on the medical school, who worked together last year on cybersecurity, it's just as important because the governor's budget, we want to have our items in the governor's budget. That is the first line in the sand. It sets the parameters for negotiating in a legislative session. Now, let me also say, we have very often not been in the governor's budget and we've still gotten what what is important to us. But that is really our goal. So with this timeline, so let me just go to the next slide. So that's the timeline, and I just wanted to kind of talk about what we're trying to capture. Some of you will have seen this. We realized, Regent Shower and I realized that we hadn't presented to the Board of Regents since October of 2017. That this is the graphic that we use to talk about what we do, and we've done this for about 10 years. We work this direction as much as we work this direction, so that we are working with all of our stakeholders and going together to government. Government looks like lots of different things. The other thing that I want to really point out are these white arrows, because we need to be internally coordinated for us to be successful, so that we're not taking chancellors, we're not taking deans, we're not taking other vice presidents by surprise. And so this window of time here, if we are able to give you notice in May and talk with you about criteria and starting the process, and then have that time period to work on it, and then have the delegated authority to the president to work with the executive committee, that's what we are trying to achieve. So the other thing I will identify as we talk about the criteria. So are there any questions about this? Because I will talk a little bit about the criteria we have before you. So first,
Yeah,
Thank you for the context.
this seems like this would provide some context for both of these next two items. So
yes, that's this
Thank you.
timeline. I will keep it up because it's appropriate for capital as well. And the capital process is much further along because of Olivia's work and her work with Chris Mueller. So one of the things that we're asking for you and to take action on tomorrow is to begin the process for developing decision packages. I think you might remember when we've talked about funding formula, we're trying to use those technical words so that we're all on the same page. So the operating budget request is called a decision package. So we would like approval to develop decision packages. So compensation is always our #1 decision package. And so I want to say that we will not be developing that. We know we will be developing that as a decision package, but that's not subject to this process or to this criteria. So first, we want to develop a decision package that meets state public policy priorities. For example, those include climate, they include public health, equity, and employer needs for high demand degrees. And we can look at the governor's budget and what the legislature passes, and we know that those are priorities. We know that for WSU, high demand degrees, and that's the same for the research institutions, that is a public policy priority. Second, they have to meet strategic plans. So we've done a lot of work and we've talked a lot here about strategic plans at the system level, campus level, but then also at college level. So we want to make sure that whatever we're bringing forward, it actually fits the strategic direction we want to go. It engages stakeholders. So stakeholder engagement is 2 parts. I think the medical school is a great example of it. We have been working together on issues around health sciences for a decade now, and so we have a strong platform of relationships. So whatever we bring forward, we want to think about, do we have those relationships in place? And how do we leverage them so that we are going together? We're meeting their needs, we're going together to public policymakers. We may, for example, get some great concept papers or some great ideas that we don't have the visibility around, but if it meets our other goals, then we can work on it for the next 2 years and think about it for the following biennium. And then the last one is really important, is that multi-campus collaboration to expand the scope and geographic reach of support. That is preferred, and that is what we are hoping for. It's really helpful for us, and at the end of the day, we got to get votes. We use 50, 25, and 1. And so if we can look at a multi-campus collaboration, and those collaborations we have been thinking would be approved by the Office of the Provost, so they would have gone through an academic process, and the chancellors would be working with deans and amongst themselves before it goes forward. So that is the information on the criteria that we have at this time.
Appreciate the discipline on the criteria.
Yeah, absolutely. Are there any questions?
do you have any other context or commentary that you want to make?
Yeah, I'm gonna do capital next. I'll help you join this, but I'll wait till if there's questions.
Okay. Are there any questions?
I would just point out that Chris Mulick and I started doing legislative visits for next year, yesterday.
Oh.
So, I mean, it's a year-long process, and I want to emphasize that, at this point, we're not asking for any particular thing because nothing's been put out there. We have general conversations around compensation and how things are going. So this summer will be really active out meeting with legislative colleagues in their home districts. So.
And it was also identified as a good opportunity for us to hear from them. Because they're hearing from a lot of their constituents right now, and many of you are working with those other constituency groups. So it's a good opportunity to listen and to meet with other stakeholders.
I mentioned that I was on a call, one of the legislative calls where typically we would go to
Yeah.
Olympia, right?
Yeah.
And do that. And I was meeting with a group where we were daylighting compensation as a priority, and they were quick to bring up declining enrollment, and that in typical businesses, if you have declining revenue, you don't ask for a raise. And so really getting clear on kind of our messaging as I'm 911, Chris, how do I answer this question? That the compensation piece is so critically important from my perspective, that not having had that compensation, the ability to increase compensation and success this year from the legislature, that I'm excited to hear that a compensation philosophy and plan is part of our priorities over the next year, because I think including that as continued priorities within our decision packages and our philosophy and what we're taking out to the legislative ambassadors, those that we want to be supportive, is important. I also think we need to send a strong message to our faculty and staff that compensation is an important part of how we are showing up to support our team. I'm glad to see that's part of how
80% of what we do is just educate, right? That's what we're doing. And I think the compensation piece, we had a lot of success a decade ago. We had a lot of success a decade ago talking with the legislature and educating members on, price versus cost for students, right? Because that was confusing. It's hard to understand. That's very similar to what we are going through right now with the legislature, with the governor's office, with OFM, on the funding formula that is about compensation. And so our goal, number one priority, without question, this biennial budget is going to be around compensation, both in terms of improving the formula. So we want to keep improving the formula. We'd like to see as big of an improvement as we can get, if not actually correct it, but then also have investments so that we have pay raises for faculty and staff. And that goes to student success.
Any other comments?
For those of you that are on the advisory councils, our advisory council summit will be very much focused on compensation. And so we will have the Washington Business Roundtable. We have Washington Student Achievement Council. They will be coming. Chancellor DeWald is hosting that. Chancellor Vice President, that position, Chancellor. And so that will be our deep dive so that we can educate all of our advisory councils about that issue and help to understand kind of where the coalition is at.
And I think, hopefully I'm not speaking out of turn, there might be an opportunity for a joint dinner as that is wrapping up and the Board of Regents.
That would be
Maybe
wonderful.
Not new. Anyway, never mind. That would be a great opportunity in the future for some crossover.
That would be
between the
wonderful.
two groups.
And
All
we
right.
have we will have those leaders are going to be attending, and they would be available for dinner as well.
Okay, let's move to capital budget requests. Anything else for Colleen?
I'll go ahead and get started because it's similar in that we're going to be seeking authority to delegate approval to the president so that we can move this forward, as well as bring back in August if there are any changes. I think the difference here is we actually have our proposed request for you, and we'll go through that, as well as the process, because we started this process in September of 21. That is what it takes to get all of the input from the campuses, the colleges, and vet those and run them through formulas and, kind of do a ranking and then have people take a look at that and, decide what fits best with our strategies and our fundraising plans. So
It's a fair state. I mean, capital budget tends to be, usually you have a pretty good sense year over year of what a lot of those projects may or may not be. Is that a fair statement? I mean, when you're going to go build a medical school, that doesn't surprise you out of the blue.
It does. Yeah, that was actually one that did come out of the.
Well, but
We
it took
did-
it over five, but then it was year over year that we looked. But I mean, it seems like, you know, you have your priority list of projects that we've been looking at.
I think I would say that, Marty, as we do better planning, longer term planning, then we map this out. And when I first arrived, my sense was, and Olivia might comment on this, everybody's idea of how you did a building was you kind of knocked one of the other people off the list, hopefully, as opposed to, here's what we're trying to do, let's raise some private funds, let's integrate into a plan. So I do think it comes across now as logical and methodical, and there's a reason to do it. It was a little more random a few years ago.
Marty, the other thing too, it's very akin to how we used to do federal relations. So federal relations, we used to just bring forward a list of projects.
Right.
And it didn't match the delegation, the priorities, and they would just disregard it. And this is not Olivia. This where we're at now is Olivia's leadership, but we would have a list and then it would be out of scope or in terms of scale of what we were going to get. It didn't reflect campuses and other stakeholder priorities or fundraising priorities. And so now we have a formula, I would say it's a formula, but it's, yeah, but it allows flexibility. So the buildings that we're getting for the federal building, for that ARS building, you know, those came kind of suddenly, 8 years suddenly, but then we needed to go to the legislature and ask for demolition. And so this formula was able to accommodate that in a way that makes sense for us to communicate internally as well as externally.
Two things. The first, if you were tuning into the infrastructure committee that a few of us had, one of the things that I think, Olivia, you mentioned was the partnership with Chris, and not necessarily asking for things that may not be stakeholder maybe endorsed, or you know, that we've had that stakeholder engagement or realistic. And so that partnership is so critical. And then the second, Colleen, I think your point about the federal engagement, I think it would be good, while these two items are focused on state, for us to do a presentation on that federal engagement piece. Because I mean, as we were talking about the Capitol, I was thinking about the USDA building, which does impact this, but it's not part of the state capital ask, it's a federal. So if we could maybe add that to kind of our list of opportunities to look at a joint presentation on some of that federal engagement, that would be.
The dairy, I think, could be an example of that as well.
Yeah.
It's really federal money.
And donor money.
Yeah, and donor money. Yeah, it'd be great. Look forward to it.
So maybe I'll start by talking about the guiding principles.
You just speak up a little bit.
Oh,
It's hard to hear. Hello.
So I'll start by talking about the guiding principles and how we put the budget together, some of the structure. And if there are questions, we can go through each item individually. You'll see that in the write-up, there is the request itself and a 10-year plan. I think that the request itself for 23-25, we do mean it. The 10-year plan is, we're thinking, you know, so it's not a commitment. It's, well, we think like this, but, and frankly, you know, I don't even know what I'm doing tomorrow, and you want me to tell you what I'm doing in 10 years. I think we just want to leave the flexibility to be able to plan some of these things. So the first thing about the budget is what Colleen said. We want to know roughly what our share of the whole pie is and not ask for more than that. For one, it's being a good citizen. This is Chris Mueller talking to me. Olivia, we want to be good citizens. So you don't want to be greedy, because when you're greedy, what happens is, you know, if you think you're going to get 15 and you ask for 20, you're going to get 15. And what happens is the 5 that's missing is not our choice. We don't get to decide what's missing. So number last gets funded and number 3 doesn't. So we're like, okay, deal with it. You know, if we think we're going to get 15, which by the way, we think we're going to get between 150 and 160, we bracket it down to what that is. And it's kind of painful because, you know, in the old days, everybody would line up with their $90 million building. Well, that's not happening. We have too many needs to do one at a time. We need to hit as many needs as possible. So the first thing is the total of the state budget. Now, as an aside, I would say we're devising a budget model that's all funds. So one day, as the donor machine starts rolling, as the federal machine starts rolling, borrowing again, is possible one day.
Someday.
Maybe one day. So we just want to be able to accommodate all that. So you're seeing the state request, but at one day in the future, we hope to have an all funds capital. So the second thing is, particularly because we have so many needs and resources are scarce, we want every dollar to be like a twofer is what I call it. So you have the dollar to fix your bad buildings, but also what goes in the buildings are programs that are high on the priority list of the university. So you don't just pick a building that says, well, this is a bad building and we're gonna fix it up. But really what they're doing in the building is not moving the university forward programmatically. And the last thing is kind of about what we've talked about, no net new. So I think you've all heard me ad nauseum talk about our deferred maintenance backlog. One of the ways we're solving that is we just have more space than we have money to adequately take care of. And if you can't get more money, then what you do is you get rid of space. So you have the fun with fractions, you want to be at $10 per foot. You're currently at 2. So the way to do that is your square foot, you get that reduced. Then you get closer and closer to your $10 a foot, starting from $2 a foot. So that's always been our priority. And that translates to what we call no net new. And what that means is we are going to try to renovate more buildings than we are just building new buildings. And if we do build new buildings, we want to be sure that it replaces a bad building somewhere else. And that the new building is a little bit tighter in terms of space optimization. Right now, what happens is people move out and the other people in the building kind of ooze into the space. And so you end up with, you have a PI in chemistry and they have 5,000 square feet because their neighbors moved out. And if you look at peer comparisons, they could be 2,000 per PI up to down to 1,200 square feet per PI, but because this is what they oozed into, that doesn't mean that's what they really need to be productive. It's better to have better and tighter space than a lot of bad space. And so that's sort of the guiding principles that we're doing here. So what this translates to is you'll see in the request kind of the standard minor capital. Minor in the state world is a group of projects under 2 million, and they group them together into minors. And there's minors for buildings and there's minors for programs. Then they have the majors, which is roughly anything over 10 million. And we've been asking for minors and majors. But when you read the instructions, you say, well, it doesn't say we can't go between 2 and 10. So we've been asking for 2 and 10, between 2 and 10 as well. And because we have so many needs that we're trying to fit into a fixed budget, you will see that the budget has a lot of those under 10s. And, could we have done with more? Well, of course we could, but we have a lot of needs that we need to meet. And so we try to give everybody a slice of the most important, the most leveraging, the most urgent need for all of those needs. And the other aspect that is new about the budget is what we are calling the sustained investments. So what we used to have before is you would have a new building, design, construction. If you built the new building on the site of an existing building, you have demolition, design, construction. If you followed the state process in the old days, you had pre-design, demolition, design, construction. And what we're doing is to try to meet all needs, as many needs as possible. We're taking each of these chunks in each biennium. So you have one biennium that has demolition. You have, and obviously if you demolish a building, it's normally considered it's a good idea to move people out of those buildings. And so we have. Okay, go on.
Keep rolling, well paid.
You paying attention?
Yeah.
Okay, so for example, you'll see on the request, Eastwick and Abelson, we are improving those buildings so people in the building that we're trying to demolish can move into there. And so in a way, it's kind of a threefer because you've got a hotel to house the homeless displaced occupants. Plus you have now the ability to demolish a bad building and put a new building in its place. So we call those sustained investments because if you don't do them in order, you can't get the thing rolling. Now, almost all of our projects are that way, so you can look at the Voiland, Schweitzer Engineering Hall, because having that will allow us to vacate other bad buildings, but it is not like critical path critical, the way that Eastlick and Abelson is. If you don't do Eastlick and Abelson, you cannot house the displaced people, you cannot demolish the building. So you've got all those things in play, and that's how we came up with the choices that we made. The process is, as Stacy said, we started in September of 21. We had a call for needs. We worked with the provost office for a summit, and we tried to score those needs based on criteria that is double-sided. So we had the classic capital criteria. How does it support teaching, research, and engagement? But we also had the operational issues. How does it address deferred maintenance? How does it address safety, reduce operational risk, etc.? So if you hit those two things, you scored high. However, we also did not want this to be a scoring driven, it was scoring informed. So other things come into play. For example, if we're asked the state for a pre-design and we're in line for design for a new building, we would probably slot that in there, even though in the current biennium, maybe it wasn't scored as high, but there was an ask already. If we have a donor match, obviously that, not that you can buy your way in, but clearly having a match is important, particularly as we try to build up donor relations. So those are all the things that factored into the request that you see before you in the 23-25. And again, we did some speculating on what could be the next sets of dominoes in the 10-year plan. But I think we want to reserve the flexibility to address new needs, and as we do more planning, to be able to respond to that. So that's.
Process is, the scoring process, when it's so, and to bring everybody together, I mean, it's just, that's revolutionary for WSU. So it really is outstanding. Because of your criteria that you went through, Colleen, and because of the thoroughness of where in the detail, Olivia, and the thought, and the collaborative effort that, I mean, it what gives me great comfort in delegating authority to the president and getting to where we ultimately need to be. This makes sense.
I appreciate that. I think there are two different processes here.
Yeah.
So I mean, I think it'll be exciting to see how the operating budget is built out so that we have a little more, and you have the capital budget so well done in terms of process engagement, decision making, like it's all included here. Yeah, and you have a new ERP. I mean, like there's so much that's new on the operating side.
I will add historical context for both. I think Regent Dickinson might be the most familiar, and certainly. I was going to say, I think Regent Dickinson might be the most familiar, and then also Regent Powell, just kind of looking at how long I've worked with all of you. Now, the capital budget, we used to get a lot more money from the state. The recession changed everything. And so we still are in many respects correcting from the recession, which is 2008, 2010. But we used to get
200 million.
Yeah, over 200 million. And so this process of right sizing, there's a period of time where you hope it's going to go back. And you work with legislative members, but then you understand that revenue streams are different. And so being able to start that. With respect to operating, we have the formula, which is partly attributable to the recession. We've also had the medical school.
Yep.
So having, 10 years, literally 4 biennia pursuing medical school funding, it created a landscape where right now is the right time to do the operating budget.
So I need to move us a little bit further, a little faster. So we've got a lot of tuition fees to move through. But
Thank you very much.
is there
Thank you.
any
That was great.
questions before this team
Oh, Shane, go
departs
ahead.
by?
Right, sorry.
I do have
Yeah,
one.
no, don't apologize. I'm just like vocalizing that. Please ask questions here, and then we're gonna pivot.
Yeah, and I'm sure that you covered it in your process. I'm just curious if you could speak for a moment about how you threaded issues of equity and justice in that criteria and that process. As I'm thinking about what departments or programs might have more philanthropic support versus other ones, and how it could be easy for criteria to be,
Twist.
yeah.
I'll have two parts to that. One of them will make me sound like a wuss. So we'll start off. As I said, we have two sides. We have the programmatic criteria and building issues. We understand the building issues. We're not going to pretend we understand the programmatic issues. So we're deferring to the academy to say, these are the programs and here's why. And we'll say, yes, gotcha. So we're not driving that, but we are in support of it to the extent possible. When you talk about equity and inclusion, my mind actually goes to equity and inclusion in public procurement, which is my world. And certainly we're doing a lot of that in the public contracting world. It doesn't affect the students per se, but in terms of small and diverse businesses and the issue of small and diverse businesses in Eastern Washington and how to deal with all that is something that I spend a lot of time on. So that's my part, and I know that doesn't quite touch your question, but that's
So it sounds like essentially you're leaving it up to the areas to determine for themselves or to articulate it, like how those issues of equity essentially.
and I think
Yeah, I mean, it's related to what you're asking, so I don't want to get off the topic too much, but one of the things we did this year, Olivia and her team, we came up with a way that for academic affairs, for the academic schools and colleges, we did a kind of forum where rather than them each submitting to Olivia and the committee sort of separately without knowing what each other put in, we could talk about how do we meet the strategic priorities for WSU, and within academic affairs, they each presented so they could see where they could collaborate across colleges and across campuses. I don't believe we had done that before they were submitted, the needs were submitted to Olivia, and that included student success, equity, diversity, and inclusion, research excellence, included all of the things that are the key strategic priorities for WSU. So, it was the first time, it was a pilot process, and we're always looking to improve, but those things were definitely discussed in an open forum. Thank you.
Right, and President Schultz can elaborate on this better. A good example is CAS. CAS has, I think, our largest undergraduate programs, and it's probably among the more challenging to find a single philanthropic donor for, right? That's just really hard because of the nature of those programs. And so for that reason, we look at that college and how we advance it to make sure that the students who are in those using those buildings are having high quality and high access buildings, whereas other colleges may have different opportunities for philanthropic funding. I mean, that's a really good example. So from an operating perspective, we have the equity and toolkit, which I'm very excited that we'll be able to use that. So that's really cool. We just started talking about it at the leadership level internally. So I was part of the task force. I'm really looking forward to being able to use that. I think the other thing to think about is cybersecurity was actually a pretty good example. We worked with the governor's office, worked with the office of the provost. Craig Parks was a real leader on this. We looked at where there are two-year programs because we know what the student body is that two-year programs look like. And so where there is demand for those two-year programs, we looked at how could we conceive of a program that would allow those students who are already in a two-year program to come to WSU to complete the program. So we can still take first-year students for this program, but it also allows us to partner with 2 years. So there's a number of ways that we do that. And that is a priority for the governor's office and for our legislature.
I assumed that it had been and was. I was just
Great
curious
question.
to hear a little bit about that process. So
Yeah.
thank you for sharing and for all of you.
Okay.
I will just end it by saying, this is what we anticipate as being the final. If there's any changes, it would be delegated to Kirk, but shared with you. But
Yes.
we're pretty much ready to move forward with this capital. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, sorry, we have had a really great conversation and we have a lot left to continue. So my packet still has a lot more to go. So
I'm
tuition.
gonna get you through it pretty quickly.
I know you are, but, okay, so, action item number 2. Oh, wait, we just did that, so.
You're already on 3.
We're already on 3, never mind. Okay, all right, tuition increases. Stacy? you have some.
I'm gonna stand up if that's okay.
Yes, please.
Tired of sitting, so. So what I want to do really with these slides is probably cover items 3 through 9. Awesome. Leaving only athletics after that. So, and to remind you that I know that this is a difficult process for Regents. And so in January, we had the discussion about, we would like to kind of signal what we probably will do currently and in future years in terms of tuition increases and get your feedback on that. We did future action on tuition for our undergraduate, graduate, resident, non-resident, as well as the professional programs, and then indicated that we would do service and activity fees, as well as the allocations that require Regents approval. So that those are all in this packet. And so even though your packets contain all of that information, most of which you've seen before, and the presentation I'm kind of moving forward to, we told you what we were going to ask for. The justification is the same as it was last time. And then we're including the feedback that we got from students as we shared the information on both the tuition increases and the professional fee increases, as well as the mandatory rates. So we have the undergraduate and graduate tuition increase, college of pharmacy and pharmaceutical sciences tuition increase, vet med, engineering, technology, management, and masters in business administration. So again, it's the same ones that we brought before. So there's been a little bit of a development. I told you that we were really looking at 2.5%, but there's a maximum set by the Office of Financial Management, and we got our memo today, and that maximum is 2.4%. So we're going to ask you to give us a slightly lower tuition increase. So I do appreciate their timeliness, but at least we got it in before the Regents. I actually had written the agenda item to say, or whatever OFM decides. So this has been adjusted. It's a bit lower than you saw before, and so for all of these. So that's the adjustment then from what's in your rates. The justification remains the same. The enrollment declines, and then balancing out rising costs, inflation, pointing out the increased aid for students with the Washington College grant that guarantees financial assistance for eligible undergraduate resident students with the awards based on income and need. And also, the state budget did expand the WCG program and included $150 million of funding for low interest loans. So that's another bit of help, as well as Pell, federal financial aid awards were increased by up to $400 for eligible students next year. And again, this is a balance. We understand that's tough. We're still asking for a tuition increase. It's a modest increase. We're dealing with a lot of inflation and cost. This will be used to help us stabilize our budgets, also help protect jobs. It certainly helped us with the salary increase that we proposed. We had that discussion about fund shift, and the university would have to put some money in for our faculty and professional staff to receive a 2.5% salary increase. And then again, the inflation is definitely hitting us in all aspects, all costs, all types of things. So our student feedback, we presented to the Student Governance Council on April 23rd, which is the elected representatives of undergraduate and graduate professional students at WSU. And this is the official representative group. The SGC provided the following feedback in a memo. I've put this in here. They acknowledged the presentation and appreciated the explanations and the justifications. And while it does increase, the increase does impact students, the Student Government Council understands the need for such actions, and also acknowledged the increase in Washington State grant as well as Pell. So I wouldn't say that that's, oh, we're all for it, but they certainly listened well and understood about the information that we put forward. And then I put no other feedback was received on tuition. So We also let students know that they can provide feedback up through close of business yesterday via an email address to the budget office, and we monitor those. And some of you remember in the past, we've given you a few sheets of paper on that. So now we're on the professional fees, and this is the pharmacy's tuition increase. And again, this is the same as it was in the future action item that we presented. The justification is more detailed in your packet, but is summarized here about kind of looking for more smaller incremental increases, and the costs, the regulatory requirements, accreditation demands, those types of things. And that it supports the mission to provide the best student experience through student support and all of the things that you've seen in that information provided before. How the increase will be used, approximately $270,000 broken down by these categories here: advisor, program specialists, and clinical faculty. So I think they did their homework in terms of identifying that. And then the student feedback that was received. And we did ask the deans if they wanted to participate in this and talk about it in case you have questions. And I don't know if they're on Zoom or are they logged in? Is Dr. Lee is so now I'm not saying he needs to talk, but I wanted to just note all of the feedback that was provided. There was some appreciation expressed by the students that he came to visit with them personally to talk about these needs. And I didn't know if there was other things that the dean might want to add.
Sounds like he might be leading graduation.
He's
Okay.
completing it probably.
Yeah.
Okay. No
Clearly the
problem.
priority.
But I think, so in this instance, we're just providing generally the feedback as well as the detail that we put in the packet. So now we're on College of Vet Med tuition increase. Again, same as we were proposing in March with those different percent increases. The justification for the increase, you will see rising costs a lot, as well as some justification as in not doing some increases in the more recent years. And then how the increase will be used. Again, this is just summarized here from what was in your packet for facilities, for the teaching hospital, for the Student Success Center, and then the student feedback. And certainly there was concern expressed from the students on this increase that was basically provided to the college and summarized here. And then the college held a town hall to explain how the student education, or to what they were proposing the money for, and then quarterly meetings with class leadership, regular monthly emails, and a lunch with the dean. So I think the deans have taken this very seriously in terms of understanding the impacts on students and seeking their input for this. And I don't know if Dean Borges is on, or if there's any questions.
I'm here and happy to answer any questions, but that's what it was.
Did I describe that okay, or is there anything you wanted to add?
No, that's perfect. It sounds like the information was provided in the packet too. So if there's questions, I'm happy to answer, but otherwise that's great.
Okay, engineering technology management tuition changes. Again, the same, you'll recall that there was a proposed decrease in the standard tuition and then increases in military, government employee, and student and affiliate rates. And this is the justification for that, to get the rates more in line with each other. And then the 5% differential rate closes the gap on the discounted rate from 40 to 30%, and describes the students that would be impacted by that. And then focusing on program quality as well as rising costs. The justification and how the money will be used. So there's kind of rebalancing the revenues from those different sources. Faculty develop, curriculum review and design, and increase in costs. student feedback. In this case, a survey was sent to all current students and fall 22 applicants. And this describes the responses regarding the proposed decrease in one and then the increase in the others. And then the college did respond that students received the email addressing the questions that were raised by the respondents and provided that information. It's identified below on self-sustaining the programs and additional costs and personnel. Questions? Any comments from the dean?
No, thank you, Stacy. That was it.
Okay. Online Masters of Civil Engineering tuition setting. In this case, it's the first year of the program, so we're just setting the tuition. And so it said the first semester and initial rate is based on analysis of employer support, comparable programs in alignment with rates for other programs there. And online civil engineering degree shows the rates within that range. So $866 per credit is considered reasonable at that point. No student feedback yet, but next year. Questions on that? Okay. And there's Dean Hunter for the MBA proposed tuition increase, again, at the 2.5% rate for the online MBA and the military and the executive MBA and the military rate for that. And Chip, I'm happy to let you speak about the justification and the feedback if you want, but I've gone ahead and included the summary here. And how the funds will be used, investing in staff and programming, high quality faculty, retained staff, and as well as a good market.
So we can do that.
An email was sent to all enrolled students into the programs, and they were provided 21 days to respond, and they did receive 27 responses, some neutral, few neutral, some negative, citing expense to students, and then a respondent requesting grandfathered rates, and then the college response thanking them as well as confirming that the information would be shared with the committee.
So Stacy, was the 2.4 limit just for undergraduate degrees only?
Undergraduate resident.
Resident, okay. So the 2.5 for this is okay.
Yes.
Okay.
Questions on that? Okay. Thank you, Chip. Okay, we'll move into mandatory fees then. These, we gave you a future action item, didn't have a lot of information because the committees have not met, and these are rates set by students at each campus, allocations by campus, and then the student technology fee only for 2 campuses that have it, Pullman and Vancouver, and then the Pullman Student Recreation Center fee. So this is the history of those fees as well as, so it's a roughly 10-year history. And then the red, the yellow line on the bottom is the proposed rate. And then you can see over the years, the decreases and increases in rate. 5 years ago, the RCW did set the maximum increase to 4%. So you might see some above 4% before that. So those were the proposed, and then these are the allocations based on the revenues that would be generated, that's inclusive of the fee increase. In your packets, there's the letters from the SNAP committees to the chancellor to the president for both the fee and the allocation of the fee. The technology fee, again, only at 2 campuses, no request for increases. It's $20 at each of the campuses, of the 2 campuses. So really you're approving the allocation. And then the Student Recreation Center fee, which Ellen, do you want to come up and talk about this? As we did just describe it at the future action. I don't believe anything has changed in there. As you can see, it hasn't been changed since fiscal year 18 or academic year 18. Any discussion on the student rec center fee?
The only thing I would add is that I don't believe in the future, when we discussed presented it as a future action item in March, the student recreation advisory committee had not yet determined a rate, what they were going to ask for. We were pretty sure they were going to ask for an increase, but we weren't sure what it would be. And so this was a unanimous vote by that advisory board to recommend the increase that you see there. And it will be the first increase they've had in, as you can see, in 5 years.
Okay, so the only thing I was dishonest about was what wasn't in there was the housing and dining rates, item 6. So we'll discuss that now, but that concludes all of the other tuition order items. So on this item, the request remains the same as it was for the future action item. However, we do have a letter that I just handed out that was distributed. We just received that letter last night from in fact, I don't have it in front of me, but
Ray Angel.
yeah. To discuss, yeah, come on. Because those were certainly. Thank you. So again, if we go to that item, then it's the same rates that were in the future action item.
Exactly. So I actually came up here probably mostly to answer questions rather than provide any additional information. Nothing has changed from the future action item that we brought you in March.
No, it may be irrelevant, but the question I have is context with regards to all Washington institutions. So how are our increases relative to the other schools? And is everyone passing inflation on and everything else to, the students, this context?
Are you talking just specifically in housing and dining rates?
I'm talking about tuition also.
Okay, the whole.
Yeah,
where everyone else is coming in.
Generally speaking, what we found is all of the institutions are requesting that maximum amount. So I would suspect 2.4%. We don't always know. We're the only semester-based institution, so we go first. They wait and see what we do. That's not entirely true, but they generally go after that. So when it comes to that undergraduate rate, we've said it's been very close to that amount. And in fact, I think we've been slightly less because a couple years we went below the maximum allowed. We can provide that information.
The fee breakdown would be an interesting one to understand where we rank on just our student fees across the board.
We can share it. I think we can find that and share it. It will be complicated because having worked at 2 institutions in the state, the fees don't match. It's it's not quite apples and oranges, but it's not the same flavor of apple. And because they, as an example, okay, you got Cosmic Crisp, which is of course the best. Different services and activities are covered under different fees. For example, a dedicated health fee. Not every institution has a dedicated health fee, so some of their health services are covered by a services and activities fee. But we could look at the whole package, and
Do you think it'd be helpful to just show maybe tuition separately, perhaps? Because the fees are complicated.
Yeah,
because
the
they're
fees
so
are more
different.
complicated than
But last year we were authorized up to 2.8. We didn't go up to 2.8.
Right, we went to 2.5.
Went to 2.5. Where were the other?
I think University of Washington was 2.8.
They were all the max. We were
Right, that's what I thought. So just context from last year,
Yeah.
we didn't. Go to the
Yeah,
max.
I appreciate all the data. I think part of this is the story of, we also listen to all the inputs. There's a lot of tension in the system, the context of all the challenges. And, everyone's still efforting to serve the student as best as possible. So.
This is, I think Marty did this on purpose. This is my worst meeting. Like, I hate the tuition increases. Like, I was not happy to be the chair of this committee. Kurt's talked to me like the day of more than 1 year about like why we have to do this, because I just feel so, it's so hard to think about, even if we're authorized to give an increase, passing on increases to students. Like I remember calling credit card companies while I was in college, how much do I have available to, figure out how I can make tuition? And I know what it feels like to be a first gen student who's barely hanging on to pay for tuition, and the impact is great. And so 2.5% may not be a huge deal to someone, and may not be a huge deal as I sit in my seat right now, but it is a huge deal to a lot of people, and it makes it or breaks it to their ability to continue to stay. And so it just brings us all back to, how do we tell a story about all the other resources that are available, so that you're not having to call the credit card company and find out how much you have left to make, your ability to make your rent. And so I really appreciate that comment, because I do think that we are trying to listen, and I know that everyone in this room is committed to trying to find ways to keep our students here and to reduce fees and tuition as much as possible. And yet, I don't know how we don't say yes to this and to going to the maximum. But interested in other feedback and other questions and thoughts.
I think for me, it's really stark when you don't look at these things individually, but you look at them collectively. So you're looking at a housing increase, tuition increase, parking increase, enrollment at least, and all of those factors combined. So sure, a 2.5% increase is maybe $300 for some students, but if you add that to all of these other increases, I think that can become pretty substantial and suddenly feel like a pretty significant barrier. Regarding the memo from GPSA, one question I have is so I understand that wages, salaries are going up 2.5%. Is that also applied to graduate students and those graduate stipends that are discussed here? Okay. So when I did the quick math on what a very approximate numbers that would look like, their stipends will go up about between $30 and $40, and their housing will also go up between $30 and $40. So that is hard for me to swallow, to see this much needed increase in salaries for everyone across the WSU system, including graduate students, and then to also see that that's going to be a complete wash for them. It's just hard to stomach. But I also will say I was at the Student Government Council meeting when you presented, Stacey, and overwhelmingly the students did understand the need for the tuition increase, and we're very grateful that you came and elaborated and explained all of those pieces. So I think that transparency has really helped even in this very difficult decision-making process. So
I really appreciated their graciousness. They were very, very good, and that was nice. Good question.
I think, it's an interesting thing when I think you've made the case for why we need to do this. I understand it. It's incredibly difficult. It's an interesting burden that it puts back upon the university to deliver an unparalleled experience of excellence. When you just keep raising the bar financially, the bar has to keep getting raised academically to meet that and to have the ROI if you're the student, right? And that's an interesting balance when you're also trying to ensure that you're keeping top talent and you're appropriately compensating those that are supposed to be delivering this unparalleled experience. And we're not being, as a state, we haven't been great about doing that. So it's just the tension on that is just so tight. But as a parent or as a student who is trying to figure this out, it just, the burden is heavy on WSU and financial or these institutions. But I take that really serious, that the game just has to go up then, because if we're going to charge more, we have to deliver more. Just,
Marty, one thing I want to commend Stacey and Saiji, I guess is still here, but they and their teams have really been looking closely at how we apply waivers and tuition reduction. We have been doing that, but maybe not quite as strategically as we could. And so making sure that our tuition waivers, tuition reductions are targeting those students for whom it is going to make the biggest difference. We have a very large percentage of first gen and of underrepresented students at WSU compared to other R1 publics. And so how do we leverage that and really put our waivers there so that the tuition we are collecting is adding into that ROI that you're talking about. So I really do want to thanks Stacy and Saichi and everyone who's been involved in that discussion. We're going to keep working.
I think it's important to acknowledge too, we talk a lot about the individuals that, you know, are first gen and are individuals who ultimately do qualify for financial aid. There's a population here that gets absolutely squeezed out of the market or getting to figure this out. Or we're the ones calling the credit card company, and those that actually don't qualify for financial aid, but actually don't have the support system that's paying for them to be able to go to college. And it's a lost, to me, it's a lost band of students of, you know, they might have a vehicle, they might have food security, but they may not have the ability to actually, or they're just going so far into debt on their own dime, right? So I just want to be mindful of that, because as a student who was first generation, who didn't qualify for financial aid, but didn't have parents that were paying for my education, I came out of college with a lot of debt, and not debt you want when you funded it on the back of on credit cards. So that those are things to kind of, that I think we also have to be super mindful of in a group that I want to acknowledge that is hard for our students.
We went through lots of agenda items. Regent Cerna, Regent Powell. Well, do you have any other feedback or comments or questions?
Not until we get to action item number 10.
Okay. All right.
So the only thing I was going to say is that it's a tough one, because, you know, I still think, I know it's tough for the students to deal with, but also for the sake of the institution, we have to keep that in mind.
Yeah.
So, yeah, there's no real easy answer, but I have to look at it that way.
All right, Dave, you're up pretty quick here. Agenda item number 10.
Oh, okay, thank you. That's not.
Get ready, here we go.
You don't have to stay for this one.
Dave's ready.
Helen quickly moves on.
Yeah.
Get out. Right.
I'm out of here.
All right, athletics budget transfers for fiscal year 2022.
Yes, so the next two items are athletics, and they're year-end athletics items. Per the legislation, these have to be approved before the next fiscal year. But because of the, you know, board's meeting schedule and action schedule, we are giving you our best estimate. It's really like as of the end of April as to what the year-end transfer will be. But because you've seen the budgets, we're pretty confident that we're going to be able to meet those. So what this action item does is when we do, we close out the year end for the whole university, we have to reverse deficits and then, you know, close the books, and then say we do that on June 30, and on July 1st, we reverse it back, because when you do this, what you're doing is covering the deficits to close the books, but it's not transferring that money. I think if the fear was, oh, you're going to take parking and housing money and give it to athletics, it's no, they have positive balances and athletics has a deficit one. And by the way, there's other areas at the university that has those, but we can't use appropriated funds obviously for this. So we just close out the deficit at the end of the year and reverse the entry at the beginning of the year. But the legislation requires that those transfers be approved by the regents. And so we're doing it in May based on an estimate, but then in September, we'll report to you what that actual amount was, so that we follow the approval authority required by the legislation.
And I think we'll also in September show that we did not transfer money from an increase in a parking fee to cover some expenses in athletics. So we made that clear, but I can see why people would look at this and go, well, you sort of said one thing and now you're doing something else. So I think we will just do extra diligence in that September timeframe to say, look, folks, it was there for 24 hours and then move back. So
yeah. And of course, parking would be very upset if we took that amount, because they're required to complete their, you know, projects and based on the budgets that they have. So it's a closing entry, but it's one that's brought under the spotlight because of the requirement to do it. So,
and there has been confusion about that.
There
with
has.
some of our elected officials.
Yes, we do explain a lot about that, and I hate to show people T accounts and things like that that are deep into the accounting world, but
Well, the only reason that we're emphasizing this is Dave asked us about it, but this came up about 2 months ago, 3 months ago. Some of the faculty said we heard the parking increase was actually just going to be transferred to athletics. We weren't sure kind of where that was coming from. We were really open about where the parking dollars were going to come. I could see that people go, well, you said one thing and now this is something else. So if it looks like we're overblowing something, it's just to make sure that we make this clear and that people trust that we're following what we said we were going to.
Yeah, anybody who just looks at the table, I could understand where they would come away with a misinterpretation of this if they don't read the following paragraph. But even when you read the following paragraph, I think it still could be clearer, specifically the second sentence, which states at the start of the fiscal year, the transfers are reversed. So the cumulative deficit is properly and accounted from year to year. I don't understand that sentence.
That it goes back to from whence it came.
Could
So
that
the
be
athletics
rewritten?
deficit. Yeah.
For
I don't know. I probably
better
wrote it, but.
clarity.
Did I wrote it or
So
did you write it?
what we can do is we can work with Stacy to rewrite that last sentence.
Before tomorrow, before the vote, yeah.
Just
That would be
providing
my
just
recommendation.
that transparent to your point. I think that that's a
Yeah.
fair.
Well, we can get
Yeah.
that done.
Yeah, thanks. Okay.
Good point. Thank you for bringing that up.
So to be clear, you said this is an estimate, so if this, regardless of if this was 75,000, or is this?
Million.
Excuse me.
Yeah.
Or 100 million or 50 million, it really doesn't matter because ultimately the money is going right back then
Yeah.
right away.
I will say it does matter because you gotta have enough to cover it, but yes, that's the accounting transaction.
Yeah, it's a funky little tricky requirement that the legislature has, right? And then yet you have to,
Well, it's standard.
yeah.
Every university
have
does
to-
it, but
you're required to
because of the legislation, we have to pull out the athletics piece and report
report
it.
it, yeah.
Okay. Good.
Okay,
11.
one more, and that is approval of the fiscal year 23 athletics budget. And I'll point to the attachment A. This is what's really helped, I think, is by doing these multi-year budgets, you can kind of see from where we came, what we're doing with the current year budget, and then what it looks like into the future. So it hasn't been as difficult to set the budget up. I know I was complaining before about, it's May is too early to approve it because athletics does get a lot of their, particularly their contributions and some of their NCAA monies in June. But now we've gotten a lot better at estimating that and anticipating it. So I feel a lot more comfortable getting the budget approved at the May meeting. And then, like I said, as you've seen every meeting, we give you an update to see where we were with the budget. So pretty comfortable with that. I think for fiscal year 23, I'll point out that you see revenues increasing over 22 and the footnotes there. Again, you have more home games, 2 marquee games with Oregon and Washington. That's why we're estimating higher ticket sales. Contractual increase for IMG, some compliance support. So that amount went up, the revenues went up, and then the expense lines below are a little bit lower. So that bodes well for athletics managing their budget. Yes, we did the financing to help with this, but it was with the understanding that they would have to manage these expenses. And so I think that's good news for the budget going into the next budget year. And also we're anticipating some expense reductions of maybe less focus on COVID, as well as some the removal of some severance payments. So that's good, making it get through there. Let's see, is there anything else I wanted to say? We talked about the debt financing and how we shifted the funds for fiscal year, from fiscal year 22 to 23. And I think I mentioned the other things. So I know John's probably out there somewhere. I don't know if, John, is there anything that I missed?
Nope, I think you've covered everything based on what we know at this moment, but happy to have any discussion or answer any questions.
I'll just mention one thing, that the Pac-12 contract expires 24, the end of 24. So that whole negotiation process, FY 25 would be the first year of a new contract. So that will certainly be taken into consideration as the budgets we look forward.
I know, Lisa, you mentioned before taking a pause. I mean, if you look at what those numbers were several years ago and you look and see the zeros out there are positive numbers, I just had that whole team, Stacy's worked closely with them to get us to a point with a balanced athletic budget that's not playing funny games with anything. I think is also a really huge, notable, positive achievement for the university.
Absolutely. It's a great way for
I
us
think I made it.
to celebrate the end of this committee meeting,
Yes.
unless anyone has any questions for John or Stacy.
It's used to make the tuition stuff look easy.
Actually, it did.
Great work. Thank you, everyone.
Wow.
Great. So what is going to happen at this point is we're going to take a short break. I think we're just going to do a 10-minute break because it sounds like we've got a full agenda for our next session. So we will meet back again at 4:40. So with that, that concludes our finance and compliance committee.
And at 4:40, you will convene and then move into an executive session.
Thank you, Kyle. Sorry for all the, good job, Lisa.
You'll be right there.
amongst my family. Of just going, hey, this is a tricky one, Mom.
Never live it down.
Never.
Are we live, Kyle?
I'll remember.
Marty. All right, thank you. The Regents will now hold an executive session.
Yeah, those are our attorneys with Davis Wright for me, and so they'll be joining us for the executive session.
Yeah, well, that's what I was about to read. Yep, okay. I thought.
Thank you. I am just announcing that the WSU Board of Regents executive session will be extending for approximately additional 15 minutes, concluding at 6 p.m. Regents executive session.
Look, they're talking about margaritas.
All right, thank you. We are reconvening the WSU Board of Regents meeting. And at this time, we will be concluding, returning tomorrow morning at 9 a.m. in this room, and look forward to coming back together. Thank you. The meeting is adjourned.